Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Journey with Dr. Dan podcast, where every journey is worth living. My name is Dr. Dan, and I'm your host for today's episode. I'm a bilingual neurolinguistic programming and cognitive behavior psychotherapist specializing in anger management issues, both court-appointed and private, marriage counseling using the EFT method, dissociative disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, depression, anxiety, dream analysis, and also provide life, business, and retirement coaching support. I provide individual one-on-one session in both French or English, and also do group setting. If you need any assistance, reach out to DMV Therapy and Coaching Services at 301-325-1550, and our website can be found at lifecoachdanamzalak.com. As this is our first recorded podcast of 2023, I'm very excited to have our 10th and last episode of season 13, a very special guest and life coach, Suzanne Hayes. And just like every of my past episode, I will leave it up to the guests to properly introduce themselves, as no one can do a better job. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. Happy New Year. How exciting is it for us to be entering into 2023, yes?
Yes, it is. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Suzanne, and also thank you so much for being the first guest of 2023.
It is my honor. Well, I help people access internal resources they never knew they had in order to create what they never knew they could. And I do that through coaching, counseling, hypnosis, writing, and speaking.
Wow, that's a lot to do. Okay. So what kind of big issues that people will experience in their lives, especially after this end of 2022? And as you know, with the pandemic, that really destroyed a lot of people mentally, physically, spiritually, financially, and so on and so forth. So how do you help them reboot their mindset?
I think there are two aspects of that come to mind for me just as we're talking here today. One is that it is really important for us, even as we're anticipating going into a new year, to have an openness to discovering more of who we really are, what our resources are internally. And the other is to be willing to relinquish our fear and open ourselves up to the forces of love that are available to us for healing, for transformation, for comfort, for safety, and to know that that is there for us if we seek it and are open to it.
So how do you seek that? If people are really kind of dealing with a lot of past emotions that have never really been resolved in their lives, how do you let them redirect their focus into something that can be productive for them instead of them lingering in misery?
One of the things I think that is so very important for us to understand, and you know this certainly in your work, is that the transformation process, the change process, the ability to be able to move forward in our life, one of the things that is most important is that we must be willing to grieve. And we don't really talk about that much. But if we're going to let go of things that are not serving us, if we're going to make changes in our life, if we're going to open ourselves up to the vulnerability of change, we also have to be willing to say goodbye. We have to be willing to let go. We have to be willing to go through the grieving process to create change. And you and I both know that grieving is the most difficult human task that we face.
Correct.
And to the degree that we love, or the degree that we are attached, is the degree of our grief.
Yes, and the pain can linger if we do not allow it to be able to accept it, because some people cannot accept the loss of a loved one, or especially during the pandemic, when those who actually passed away, may they all rest in peace, they never had family around them because of the pandemic. where they had to be able to see, at least say goodbye to them. So do you think the fact that there was no closure in saying goodbye to the loved one, this is why they let this pain linger for too long?
I think that that certainly has contributed to it. And honestly, I believe there are so many impactful factors of the pandemic that we're just beginning to understand in terms of the long-term ramifications.
Mhm.
And I would be cautious to say to anyone, you're holding on too long, or you're grieving too long, or you're resisting it, where that perhaps might be true in terms of it's people are not picking up and moving forward in their life. I think that understanding that everybody's grief process is so personal
Correct.
and so individual, and some people are able to move through it with more grace than others.
Mhm.
And we need to just be able to find the support we need if we feel isolated in the grief, because it's really the isolation very often that causes people to get stuck in the grieving process, and we can. And one of the things that I think is important is the honoring of the loss and the pain, and that also realizing that the healing process is about being able to focus on what was good in those relationships, where the blessings were, where the joys were, where the good memories are. That's so important that we hold on to that and appreciate that, and allow ourselves to work through the messy process of grieving. Grieving isn't pretty, it isn't smooth, it isn't linear. It's difficult and messy and challenging, and we simply need to be able to know that it's okay to go through it, however we do that.
So, okay, let's go and focus in the psychological aspect of grievance. And I know that this is something that a lot of our listeners, and thank God this year we surpassed the 1 million listeners for the happiness journey. So I'm very, very glad. But if someone, as you mentioned, doesn't feel, or they go through the grievance much quicker or much more efficiently, does it mean that somehow they didn't have a good relationship with that person, and they don't feel the same pain as if they would if that relationship would have been closer?
That's an interesting question. And I have a memory that came to me as you were saying that, and that was of my father when my mother passed.
Okay.
And it had been very difficult for him. They had been together for decades. And he grieved deeply when she passed. But he also started dating about a month after her passing. And my brothers were shocked. They were like, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I knew that if I just sat around in my pain, I would go crazy," is how he put it.
Okay.
And I also knew that that isn't what she would have wanted for me. She would have wanted me to have moved on with my life. Now, some people would not be able to take that kind of action so quickly.
Correct.
And it's really important for us to not judge people in that journey, right? Because we all have our own readiness of moving into something new. But I thought it took great courage, and it was very wise on his part, because he really cherished life and he wanted to live life, and he didn't want to get stuck in that isolation and grief. And it was several years before he actually remarried, but he knew that he needed to have companionship and interaction. And he began to step out in his life and meet people and do things that he hadn't done. And it was not an easy thing. He was in his 70s and he was single, and he hadn't dated since he was a very young man. So it was a really
Exchange.
challenging thing. It took great courage for him to do that. But he had the wisdom to really follow his inner guidance
Mhm.
and say, this is what I need to do to take care of myself.
And do you feel that those who, for example, who cope with the loss much faster or much efficiently, does it mean that also they should ask themselves question if they have any empathy, any love towards anyone, just like what narcissistic people would have? They would recover quickly from the loss of a loved one. Do you think that this is something to be concerned about, that maybe they have some sort of mental instability?
Well, I think there's a distinction between what might appear as easy recovery in a narcissist,
Okay,
because a narcissist has limited capacity for empathy,
correct.
right? So it's not really recovery from anything because they don't really attach from their heart in the same way. So it's not, it might appear to be recovery, but it's not really recovery because you have to go through the grieving process. But if someone begins to move forward in their life in what appears to other people as being more quick than they ought to, it's very important to not judge that, because it may in fact be that they have and probably will continue to be in the grieving process while they're moving forward. And that in fact, because they've experienced love and empathy and compassion, they have that capacity to move forward and extend that to other people. And that's what's so important for us to appreciate in our human experience, is that when we have love and we've been loved, we have a greater capacity to love and receive love. And so when we have a loss, it doesn't keep us from loving. It allows us to continue to trust that and move out and to love again.
Beautiful. Now, in your practice, Susan, what are the most common issue that you see that repeats themselves the most? Is it like mostly those who have lost someone, those who actually have been cheated on in their relationship? What is the most common problem that you see, or the common denominator that comes often?
Well, you know, I've been doing this for like over 40 decades now, right? So that's a lot of experience. And I would say that probably over the years, the issues have ebbed and flowed. But probably I would say, and this may sound a bit simplistic, but I believe that the common denominator when people are stuck, and that's what people come to me for, right? That's why I wrote the book, Freed from Stuck. I realized that's what I've been doing for 40 years. I've been helping people become freed from stuck. That when people are stuck and they come to me, it's really because I think foundationally, they have not learned how to access their own internal resources to recover, to problem solve, to move forward. And that very often they are stuck in fear or pain or some unmet need that needs to be attended to. And once they discover that, once that's identified for them, and they begin to understand that they really do have the capacity to change and heal and transform, then they're able to move forward in their life. But I think in a broad statement, I think that's kind of foundationally what happens for most people.
Okay, so if let's say for our listeners, because what I want our listeners to hear or to learn is something that they can get from this podcast. I want them to be able to basically apply and put into practice what we try to give them, the information that we're trying to provide. So if let's say, if you would summarize, for example, Suzanne, I'm not saying that this should replace them reading your book, but if you would summarize to say, okay, how do you guide them from step 1 to step 5 to find out why they're stuck and what are the triggers that get them stuck in a position that they're in and they feel completely lost?
Okay. Those are several questions there. So let me start with the first part. to identify what I call the 5 essential elements that are necessary for the change process, we can use the acronym FREED, and my book is based upon the metaphor of crossing a bridge from stuck to freed from stuck. So as we're standing in front of the bridge, the first element is F, which is face the bridge. This is about identifying the real problem, which has to do with some pain point or unmet need that needs to be attended to. Once we've identified that, then the next step is R, or recognize the bridge, which is about looking across the bridge and identifying and creating a vision of how we want our life to be different. The more vivid it is and the more emotionally charged it is, the more that vision, that dream, will serve as a magnet to draw us across the bridge. The next element is embrace the bridge, which is about identifying any blocks or struggles that we might have, any challenges, and then developing a strategy to begin to move forward. The next E is exit the bridge, and this is what we were talking about earlier, the importance of letting go of what's no longer serving us, and that means attending to the grief. And then D is discovering our destiny as we arrive at the destination. And by that, I mean that in any change process, we come to know ourselves better. And that is where we discover what our true values are, what our purpose is, what provides joy and passion to us. And that is the gift in the transformation process. And then, of course, we know, Dr. Dan, that every time we cross a bridge, there will always be another bridge and another bridge and another bridge. But if we come to understand that those elements are really important as a structure to be able to get through those places where we get stuck, we can use that to continue to cross those bridges. And in fact, they do get better because we are less afraid and we feel better equipped to move ourselves forward.
So that fear of crossing that bridge, Susan, as the metaphor that you're using, if they say they crossed a bridge before and that bridge collapsed, okay, then at this point, whatever bridge they see up front when they face it, they may assume that this bridge will collapse. How do you circumvent that fear that this bridge is more stable and that you have no choice to cross it?
It's an interesting metaphor because what I would say is that part of what happens for us is that we don't appreciate that we have the capacity to create the bridge. In other words, we have the capacity to build a structure to get ourselves from one point to another. And the better we know how to do that, the more likely we are to make it to the other side without the bridge collapsing. You're using a wonderful sort of fantasy metaphor there of, you know, if you just throw a couple of logs across and you try to cross the bridge, it's likely that you might be at risk at falling. But if you think about how to best build that bridge and get there, really invest the time and energy to make that transition, it's more likely that you're going to get there more successfully and with less challenge. Doesn't mean the wind doesn't blow and the rain doesn't come and it's scary. Doesn't mean any of that. It just means that the more thoughtfully we understand the change process and we make choices to trust ourselves, our inner guidance in that process, the more likely we are to arrive at the other side successfully.
So we're basically all very good architects.
We are amazing architects that we underestimate. I love that. Yes. Yeah. We are so creative if we allow ourselves to be. That's the joy of life. It's like, what kind of rock and bridge can I build to get to the other side?
That's so true. And when it comes to the tools that are needed. I'm not talking about lumber and hammers and nails, but for them to be able to design that bridge that is ideal to successfully reach the destination. But after that destination, and you mentioned that there's other bridges. Now, obviously, other bridges is other circumstances happening in their life, not necessarily related to grief, but any other thing, financial, health, whatever it is. Um, and this is like a unknown world that they're going to venture in. If we're not equipped with the right tools, how do you give them that knowledge on how to cross that next bridge? How do you, I mean, if it's something completely new, it's not like it's making is making old mistakes. This is like really new mistake that never really happened in their life. How do you help them with that?
I think there are two tools in our toolbox that we underestimate, but that are incredibly useful and powerful in making change. One is curiosity.
Okay.
And in order to be curious, we have to feel a certain level of safety. Like it has to be okay to explore those possibilities and to open our mind. But curiosity is really the doorway into creativity and problem solving.
All right.
And the other